In a city that had long forgotten hope, a dying preacher clung to a fragile ritual, leaving anonymous prayers on scraps of paper. He believed his light was fading, but a single, wind-swept note would soon bridge the chasm between his quiet despair and a hardened ex-con's raw hunger for meaning. The light was fading from Reggie in more ways than one. At 65, his body was a brittle cage for the lung cancer that ravaged him from within, each breath a shallow, rasping victory. He was a former street preacher whose pulpit had once been the bustling city corners, his voice a booming testament to faith. Now, his ministry was a silent, solitary ritual performed in the pre-dawn chill. Every morning he would drag his skeletal frame to the steps of St. Jude's Cathedral, a grand, forgotten giant of stone and stained glass. The diocese had shuttered it 7 years ago, and now it stood as a monument to its own namesake, the patron saint of lost causes. Reggie's congregation was the anonymous ache of the city, and his sermons were scraps of paper. With a hand that trembled violently, he'd pull a stub of a pencil and a torn piece of a utility bill from his pocket. The effort of bending over to write on the cold stone step sent a tremor of pain through his chest. Today's message was for a ghost he felt lingering in the urban ether. To the soul who feels forgotten by the world, you are not. A light is finding its way to you. He folded the small note with reverent care. Pushing himself up, his knees cracking in protest, he shuffled to the colossal oak doors, their carvings worn smooth by a century of weather and hands. He meant to tuck the prayer into the deep fissure between them, a tiny offering to an indifferent monolith. But as he reached forward, a wet, hacking cough seized him. It was a vicious, body-racking spasm that buckled his knees and stole the air from his already failing lungs. The world swam in a gray haze. The folded paper, his small act of hope, slipped from his numb fingers. It fluttered for a moment, a white moth in the gloom, before a gust of wind caught it and skittered it away, down the sidewalk and around the corner, lost. Reggie's world had shrunk to the four walls of a single, charity-subsidized room that smelled perpetually of damp plaster and old regrets. A single, bare bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting a jaundiced glow on the peeling paint. His only window looked out onto a grimy brick wall, a constant, unyielding symbol of his confinement. On one of those walls, a clinical white notice was tacked up, its black text a stark reminder, a prognosis of less than 3 months. It hung there like a final, unappealable judgment. His savings, a meager collection from decades of odd jobs and sparse stipends, had evaporated into a mist of medical bills and basic survival costs. His daily sustenance was a grim lottery of what the food bank offered. The physical toll was immense. His clothes, once fitting, now hung on him like a scarecrow's rags, and a constant, low-level ache had settled deep in his bones. Food had lost its taste, replaced by the metallic tang of his medication. The simple act of opening a can of beans became a monumental effort, leaving him breathless and trembling. He had tried once to seek help from the established church. He'd walked 2 miles to the active parish of St. Michael's. The pastor's office was warm, smelling of lemon polish and old, leather-bound books. Pastor Davies, a man with a crisp collar and an even crisper smile, listened with the polite detachment of someone managing a busy schedule. He'd given Reggie a bag of canned goods and a perfunctory, "God be with you, brother." When Reggie, his voice raspy, mentioned his quiet ritual at the abandoned cathedral, the pastor's smile tightened. It was an unsanctioned, unofficial act, an untidy expression of faith that didn't fit into their neat bulletins and organized outreach. "Perhaps your energy is better spent in quiet prayer at home, Reggie," he'd suggested gently, a soft dismissal that felt like a door closing in his face. The encounter left Reggie feeling more profoundly alone than ever. Back in his room, the silence pressed in. His entire life had been dedicated to a belief in connection, in a shared spiritual current. Now it seemed that current had been rerouted, leaving him in a dry, desolate riverbed. His only remaining connection was through these paper prayers, these whispers into the void. Most, he knew, were swept away by the city's street cleaners, their messages of hope treated as common litter. Others were dissolved by the rain, their ink bleeding into meaningless gray pulp on the pavement. A deep, chilling doubt began to creep into the marrow of his bones. Was this it? Was his life's work, this tiny, sputtering candle flame he was so desperately shielding against the wind, destined to go out without ever warming a single soul? Jordan, at 23, walked with the coiled tension of a man who expected the world to shove him at any moment. He'd just been released from the state penitentiary after an 18-month sentence for a stupid, desperate act of burglary. The prison gates had clanged shut behind him, and he'd been spat out onto the street with $25 in his pocket and a thick, suffocating blanket of shame. The city felt alien, its noise and speed a jarring assault on senses dulled by routine and confinement. He was a ghost haunting his own hometown, invisible to the rushing crowds, his past tattooed on him like a brand no one else could see but he could never forget. He was drifting, aimless, his worn-out sneakers carrying him through neighborhoods he no longer recognized. The $25 felt less like a fresh start and more like a countdown to his next failure. As he passed the hulking shadow of St. Jude's Cathedral, a sudden gust of wind whipped down the street, sending a piece of trash tumbling across the sidewalk. It was a small scrap of paper that came to rest directly against the toe of his boot. His first instinct was to kick it away, another piece of urban detritus. But something, a flicker of curiosity perhaps, or just the sheer boredom of his empty day, made him stop. He bent down, his joints stiff, and picked it up. The paper was thin, torn from the edge of something else, and the handwriting on it was spidery and frail, as if the effort of forming the letters was almost too much. He read the words, "To the one who believes they are beyond forgiveness, every sunrise is a new act of grace. Please accept it." The words didn't just speak to him, they detonated inside him. They were a key turning in a lock he thought had rusted shut forever. Beyond forgiveness. That was the phrase that had echoed in the hollow chambers of his heart for years. It was the verdict he had passed on himself in the silence of his cell. The sentence wasn't just 18 months, it was a lifetime of unworthiness. A sudden, sharp sting pricked his eyes. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the street, and saw him. A painfully thin old man, 100 yards away, leaning heavily against a lamppost, his breath pluming in the cold air as he prepared to shuffle away. Jordan stood frozen on the sidewalk, the small piece of paper clutched in his fist. It felt less like paper and more like a live coal, warming his numb hand. His mind, a chaotic mess of self-loathing and suspicion, raced. Was it a trick? Some new kind of religious hustle? But one look at the old man, now moving with the slow, painful gait of a wounded animal, dismissed the thought. There was no hustle in that kind of suffering. For the next 3 days, Jordan became a shadow. He kept his distance, watching from across the street or from the alcove of a boarded-up shop. He needed to understand. He saw Reggie arrive each morning, a fragile ghost in the gray light, and perform his ritual. He saw him write, the effort a visible struggle, and then tuck the note into the door. And he saw what happened next. He saw a city worker in a fluorescent vest sweep one of the notes into a dustpan with casual indifference. He saw a dog sniff at another before its owner yanked the leash. He saw the rain turn a third into a sad, pulpy smear. Each ignored prayer was a small stab in Jordan's own chest. He also saw the depth of the old man's poverty. He watched Reggie count out a handful of coins to buy a single, day-old roll from a bakery. He saw him shiver uncontrollably in the biting wind, his thin coat offering no real protection. The man wasn't just writing about suffering. He was living it, breathing it with every ragged gasp. On the 4th day, the wind was particularly cruel. As Reggie pushed himself up from the steps, a violent, dizzy spell overtook him. He staggered, his arms flailing for a balance that wasn't there, and began to fall. In that instant, every cynical, self-protective instinct in Jordan's body vanished. He broke from his hiding spot and lunged forward, closing the distance in 3 long strides. He caught Reggie just before his head hit the stone, the old man's body shockingly light, like a bundle of dry sticks. Reggie's eyes, wide with fear, stared up at the face of this stranger, a young man with a shaved head, a faded tattoo peeking from his collar, the very image of the trouble he'd spent a lifetime preaching against. But Jordan's grip was surprisingly gentle. He eased Reggie down onto the steps, creating a shield against the wind with his own body. For a moment, they just sat there, the silence thick with unspoken questions. Then Jordan slowly uncurled his fingers, revealing the creased, weathered piece of paper. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "Did you write this?" Reggie's fearful gaze dropped to the note, then back to Jordan's face. He saw something in the young man's eyes, not malice, not pity, but a raw, desperate hunger for meaning. Reggie gave a slow, tired nod. The gesture broke the dam. Jordan used the last of his prison money to buy 2 cups of hot coffee from a nearby cart. As steam rose to warm their faces, Jordan listened, and Reggie, in a voice that was little more than a fractured whisper, began to tell his story. That first conversation on the cold cathedral steps became a fragile bridge between 2 desolate islands. From that day on, Jordan's aimless wandering found a purpose. He started taking on day labor jobs, unloading trucks at the docks, sweeping out warehouses, any cash-in-hand work he could find, his body aching at the end of the day in a way that felt clean and honest. The money wasn't for him. It went to buy cartons of chicken broth, fresh bread, a small container of milk, and sometimes a warm portion of roasted chicken from a deli. He'd show up at Reggie's bleak apartment, his presence filling the small space with an energy it hadn't known in years. At first, his movements were clumsy, too large for the cramped room. But he learned. He learned how to clean the room without disturbing Reggie's few, precious belongings. A faded photo of a woman Jordan never asked about, a small, smooth stone from a long-ago riverbed. He learned how to navigate the older man's fierce pride, presenting the food not as charity, but as a shared meal. "The guy at the warehouse gave me a bonus," he'd lie. "Figured we could both use a decent dinner." Some days, Reggie's coughing fits were so severe he couldn't hold a pencil steady. On those days, Jordan became his hand. "Tell me what to write, Reggie," he'd say, pulling out a small notebook and pen he'd bought. Reggie would lie back on his cot, his eyes closed, and dictate the prayers from a place deep within. "For the one whose shoulders are heavy with a burden no one else can see. You are stronger than you know. May you find a moment of rest today." Jordan would write down each word with intense concentration, his rough handwriting a stark contrast to Reggie's frail script, yet the spirit was the same. He became the unlikely scribe for a forgotten prophet, carefully folding the notes and, on his way to work, tucking them into the cathedral door himself. In return, Reggie gave Jordan the only treasure he had left. He directed him to a dusty cardboard box in the corner, filled with his old, heavily annotated theology books and worn-out notebooks. The pages were yellowed and smelled of time, filled with Reggie's thoughts, questions, and fervent arguments with long-dead scholars. "My voice is gone," Reggie rasped one evening, a painful effort. "Maybe you can find yours in there." So a new ritual began. In the quiet evenings, under the dim light of the single bulb, Jordan would read aloud to Reggie. He stumbled over the complex names and dense theological arguments of Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr, but he persisted, sounding out the difficult words. He read passages from the Gospels, his street-hardened voice softening as he spoke the ancient words of comfort and redemption. The stories of outcasts and sinners finding grace resonated in the small room, charged with a new, raw meaning. For the first time in his life, Jordan felt the power of language not as a weapon or a defense, but as a source of healing. In reading to Reggie, he was inadvertently ministering to his own wounded soul. He was no longer just Jordan Hayes, ex-con. He was a guardian, a student, a friend. And for Reggie, the crushing loneliness of his final days began to recede, replaced by the quiet rhythm of Jordan's reading. His faith was no longer an echo in an empty chamber. It was a seed, unexpectedly taking root in the most unlikely soil. The inevitable decline, when it came, was swift and merciless. One morning, Jordan arrived to find Reggie unable to get out of bed, his breathing a shallow, liquid rattle. The call to emergency services was a blur, the paramedics' calm efficiency a stark contrast to the panic clawing at Jordan's throat. Reggie was admitted to a public hospice ward, a clean but impersonal room where the air hummed with the quiet machinery of dying. The cancer had finally won the physical war. Reggie could no longer speak, his attempts to form words dissolving into weak, airy gasps. His vibrant faith, which had once filled city streets, was now trapped behind his clouding eyes. Jordan sat by his bedside for hours, a silent, steadfast sentinel. He held Reggie's hand, feeling the paper-thin skin and the bird-like fragility of his bones. He saw a profound sadness in Reggie's gaze, a flicker of despair. It was the look of a man who was leaving the world believing his life's work had amounted to nothing more than scattered, forgotten scraps of paper. He had planted 1,000 seeds of hope, but would die without ever seeing a single one sprout. Jordan knew he couldn't let that be the final chapter. He reached into the worn backpack he now carried everywhere, his hand closing around a folded piece of paper. He pulled it out and carefully unfolded it, smoothing the creases on the bedside table. It was a formal letter, printed on the official letterhead of Northwood Community College. He angled it so Reggie could see it clearly. It was an acceptance letter for the college's introductory course in theological studies. And on the line for the student's name, the words were printed in bold, undeniable black ink. Jordan Hayes asterisk. He leaned in close, his voice thick with emotion but steady. "Reggie, look," he whispered, his finger tracing his own name. "It's not over. The seeds you planted, I'm going to water them now. I'm going to learn, I'll keep writing. I'll keep speaking, for you, and for all the others out there, the ones like me." At the sight of the letter, a current of life, faint but unmistakable, surged through Reggie's exhausted body. His cloudy eyes cleared for a moment, locking onto the name, asterisk Jordan Hayes asterisk, and the name of the course. It was real, it was tangible. It was a harvest he had never dared to dream of. His gaze shifted from the paper to Jordan's face, and in it he saw not a conclusion but a continuation, a legacy. He tried to speak, but only a faint sigh escaped his lips. Instead, he summoned the last reserve of his strength, a final, monumental effort that traveled from his heart down his arm and into his hand. His fingers, which had been limp in Jordan's grasp, tightened ever so slightly. He moved his index finger, tapping it twice, gently against the back of Jordan's hand. It was their signal. It was the gesture he used to make when Jordan had perfectly captured the sentiment of a prayer, or when he'd grasped a difficult theological point. It meant, yes, well done. That's it. A single, clear tear escaped the corner of Reggie's eye and traced a slow path through the weathered lines on his temple. The deep furrows of pain and loneliness on his brow seemed to soften, replaced by a look of profound, unburdened peace. The fight was over. His faith had not brought a miracle of healing for his body, but in his final moments, it had delivered a far greater one, the miracle of succession. A few hours later, with Jordan still holding his hand, Reggie passed away in his sleep. The machines beside his bed fell silent, and the only sound in the room was the quiet, steady breathing of the young man who was now the keeper of the light. 3 months later, the sun cast long, early morning shadows from the spires of St. Jude's Cathedral. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Jordan stood before the great oak doors, no longer a ghost haunting the edges of the city, but a man with a place in it. He wore a clean, pressed shirt, and his posture was straight, his gaze clear and steady. From his pocket he pulled a small, neatly folded piece of paper. He had written the words himself the night before, sitting at a desk in the college library. He tucked the note carefully into the familiar fissure in the wood. It read, "To the one walking through darkness, afraid the dawn will never come, don't be, I've been there with you. Look, the sun is rising." As he turned to leave, a young woman sitting on a nearby bench, her face pale and drawn with worry, watched his quiet act. After he was gone, her curiosity overcame her hesitation. She walked to the door, pulled out the small note, and read the words. For the first time in what looked like a very long time, the tight, anxious knot of her expression loosened, just a fraction. The ministry of the forgotten cathedral, passed from a dying saint to a redeemed sinner, continued. The light had not been extinguished. It had simply been passed to a new hand.